So as we jump in today, I want you to listen to these words of a poem that many of you may have heard before, and maybe even a number of times. It's called "The Dash." I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and then spoke the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the life that they spent alive on earth. And now only those who loved them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that you still can rearrange. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real and always try to understand the way other people feel, and be less quick to anger and show appreciation more and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering this special dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy is being read with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they said about how you spent your dash? What a great thing to think about, right? When it's all over for each of us, how are we going to feel about how we spent our lives? I love all the pictures hanging all over our stage just of people's lives, right? Of the dash. This series really is all about the dash, how we are living and spending our lives. But as we start today, there's something I want to say, and I think this is true. People have a preoccupation with the beginning. Has anybody else noticed this? This is true in a lot of ways. Now, before I get into this, let me deal with that word preoccupation, because sometimes, especially when you hear that at church, that can sound like a negative, like you're preoccupied with things that don't matter. Listen, isn't it true we all have preoccupations, right? And so preoccupations are not bad things. Not every single thing all of us do has to matter. Let me say it this way. Isn't it nice sometimes just to do something meaningless? Come on, right? Like, isn't it like to sit down to watch a dumb TV show or a movie, to just rest, to take a deep breath, and to do something that has no consequence? I think that's good. It's important. Sometimes that's nice. But it's true too, right? That much of what we do, that most of what we do should matter. But we're preoccupied with the beginning. Have you noticed this with babies? Like if somebody's pregnant, if a baby is on the way, we have a preoccupation with that child, like before we even know if it's a boy or a girl, right? Like we think, and even after it's born, and I know this because I've had two of these, it basically does nothing except poop and need your attention all the time for like a long time before it really sort of becomes a contributing member of the family in any respect of that term. Come on, can I get some amens from parents in here? It's crazy how this works. We're preoccupied even when they can't do much. And so when someone's pregnant, what do we say first? Well, what's your due date? Unless you're being induced, I think we should always put an ish on the end. It is September 25th-ish, right? Because unless you're being induced, you don't really know, right? Like there's like this sort of ballpark date that it may be before and it may be after, but like you're just like, I don't know, when movement happens and there's like a little boo, like that I think it's pretty quick now, right? Like, we're preoccupied with due dates. I remember when Christopher was born, my parents, we lived in Indianapolis at the time, drove 10 hours from Canada to be there. Bethany's folks came from Michigan to be there, 5 or 6 hours, and then they like each sort of stayed and came just to be around their grandson. You know, they were preoccupied with that, and we have parties and showers and all that again for just these kids before they really even have much of a personality. The same is true with the Bible. Have you noticed this? People have a preoccupation with the beginning of the Bible. The beginning of the Bible tends to intrigue us. And so today, for a few minutes, I want to talk around this idea of in the beginning, and I really want us to think about the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to read all of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I heard a commentator say this about these first 11 chapters. The first 11 chapters of the Bible record God's goodness and humanity's repeated rebellions. Interesting, right? Isn't this good news? That even though you and I, that humanity, we've been rebellious toward God over and over, He responds to us with goodness. I love that. Which introduce violence, disorder in the founding of Babylon. Genesis 6:5 says this, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." Isn't that like a really depressing scripture? Right? That every inclination of our hearts was only evil all the time. We're only thinking about us. We're only living for ourselves. We're only being selfish and sinful. We see this over and over. And this is especially sad when we think this is only a few pages into the very beginning of the Bible. And we see this reality unfold. Don't we see the same even with newborn babies? I know they're cute and it's a little bit different, but it doesn't take very long, right? Where that little kid is doing something and you're like, no, and they smile and then they do it anyway, right? There's like this willfulness and this like, I know that you love me, I know that you feed me, I know that you change me and you care for me and you look after me, but I'm still going to do whatever I want and I don't care. Right? Like we see this even with these babies, these same kind of inclinations. So what I want to do is I want to answer some questions from the beginning. When I think about the Bible, I just picked 6 of them from the first 11 chapters of the Bible. I'm sure there's tons more. I'm not going to answer, Rob, do you think Adam and Eve had a belly button? That's another one of the ones that a lot of times, if you want to talk about that, you come talk to me afterwards. I do have thoughts about probably all of these things. The truth is that there are people and entire organizations that exist to give us answers to these questions. But I want to be honest right out of the gate. Can I do that? Ultimately, like while there's thoughts and ideas and speculation, nobody actually knows the answers for sure. Can I say that? And sometimes it's actually a really good thing that when we don't have definitive answers. And we'll see that in a minute. Do you know, and you don't have to raise your hand, but I'm going to think about this. Do you know anyone who is or has been, maybe you're one of these people or you were one of these people, who has become preoccupied with these first 11 chapters of the Bible and all of the questions that come from this part of the Scriptures? So again, preoccupations are fine, but sometimes we got to be careful they don't go too far. So here we go. 6 questions, and the first one is the big one that people sort of talk and even argue about, and it's this. How old is the earth? How old is the earth? I'll give you my answer that is going to probably frustrate some of you. I don't know. I wasn't there at the beginning, right? I don't plan on being here at the end. I don't know. What I can tell you for sure is that from people who study the Bible for a living, biblical scholars, there is pretty much universal agreement that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is a creation poem. It was written as Hebrew poetry meant to tell us that God was behind creation, that God was the force that caused all things to be created. It was not written as a science text telling us exactly how he did it, which is why I don't know how old the earth is exactly. Now, I know a lot of people would say, well, Rob, it's pretty clear because right there in Genesis, it says it was a day. And I just want to respectfully disagree and tell you, no, it actually was written in Hebrew, and it says it was a yom, and a yom can mean a day, an age, an era, an eon, etc., etc., etc. It's basically a reference to a period of time, not necessarily specifically. And I know some of you are like, well, Rob, you might say that, but I was at the Creation Museum, and they told me, fill in the blank. And I respectfully, again, I think that's a great place, and they do great things, and go there. My kids have been there. That's awesome. Where I went to seminary, and it was a very conservative seminary, actually, the Creation Museum went to different schools and said, hey, will you sign our statement of belief saying you agree with all the stuff that we sort of say and teach about Genesis and the creation of all things? And literally 100% of the Bible teachers and scholars on staff said, if the school signs that, we all have to quit because we can't agree with what it's saying. So a lot of times what we do is we think about these things through what the culture tells us instead of what the Bible tells us. And the people who look to the Bible first professionally and know what they're doing actually were like, we can't agree that this is like the one true only way that these things go. And so under the Christian umbrella, there would be 3 schools of thought about this question: how old is the earth? There are young earth creationists who would tell us that the earth is about 6,000 to 10,000 years old. There are old earth creationists, and then there are theistic evolutionists. And I know we've sort of been conditioned in the church. Anytime you hear that E word, you go, oh, like that's somehow evil or wrong. But listen, all of those groups kind of fall under the Christian umbrella. And I don't care which one of those groups you fall into or which of those sort of ways you think. If you're like, hey, I think that God created things to look older than they were, and so even though it looks like we live in a really old place, it's really young or whatever, you can be a young earth creationist, an old earth creationist, or even a theistic evolutionist. Here's what I care about. When we are so hell-bent on being right that we keep people from faith in Jesus, we are wrong. Okay? And here's why this matters. Because sometimes people, they go to a seminar, they read a book, and they're like, oh no, the earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And then somebody who actually is a scientist or works in a different field who goes, intellectually, I can't reconcile that. And I've literally watched this. I've seen friends of mine who have wanted to accept and love Jesus, and people have cornered them with this secondary issue that ultimately doesn't matter and said, no, if you don't believe the earth is only this old and that God did it exactly this way in exactly this many days, that you're on the outside looking in, buddy. And I've seen people literally kept from or walk away from Jesus because we make a mountain out of this molehill. We've got to be careful with that. So I think the earth is most likely really, really old. I don't think that God typically does things that are deceptive inherently or accidentally, but I don't really know. And honestly, I don't care because it doesn't matter at all to my faith. All right, question number 2. Did people really live to be 900 years old? Genesis 5 tells us that Adam, the first man, lived to 930 years. His son Seth lived to over 900 years. Methuselah, in the same chapter, who is the guy who lived the oldest that we see recorded, was 969 years old. Now, let me just say a couple things about this. The first one is more general that we should think about and use and apply as we read and think about the whole Old Testament. And then the other one's a little more specific. Sometimes the way primitive cultures talk about and record things is more primitive. Does that make sense? If you're a primitive culture, the way you would talk about, the way that you would record, the way you would think and express things are going to be more primitive. And so this makes sense, right? Like if that is who you are and that is what's going on in the world, you might not be quite as specific as we might be today in our culture, right? The specific details might not be important. Like, for example, a lot of the Old Testament wasn't about getting every detail right. It would have been written in a context, in a culture where people would have been like, hey, if we won the battle, it meant we picked the right God because the God we picked was the one who blessed us and gave us victory, right? Like this is how they would have thought. If you want to read a book about this, Peter Enns, E-N-N-S, wrote a book called The Bible Tells Me So, and it was very helpful and informative and mind-melting for me. I would recommend that book if this kind of stuff interests you. So I think that's true. But the idea that we were created in the beginning to live here on this earth perfectly with God forever, and the idea that that sin was brand new, and so it hadn't really taken full root, and it hadn't really started to spin out of control and make things worse. The idea that we could live for hundreds of years back then, given those factors, makes perfect sense to me. I actually have some friends who joke around and they like to say this: I ain't trying to live forever. And I don't really know how I feel about the idea of living to almost 1,000 years old. We'd have to have much better health, right? Better joints, better whatevers. But I think it's really interesting. Question 3. What are, or maybe you would ask it, who are the Nephilim? Genesis 6:4 says this: the Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So who were these Nephilim? Now, there's a lot of mystery around them. We really, again, like I've been saying, don't know. Nephilim actually means giant, right? So we know that whoever they were, these beings, they were large, they were strong. Some translations kind of hint at maybe these were fallen angels. Or if you watched the 2014 Noah movie, they were these kind of strange rock creatures. Remember that? Anyone see that movie besides me? And so, but again, honestly, I have no idea. And that's okay, because again, This makes absolutely no difference to my faith. None. Zero. Now, let me say one more thing about this. My family is not perfect. And I don't just mean my immediate family. You guys already know that about us. But when I was a kid, I still remember being young and thinking to myself, my family's perfect. Anybody else when you were little kind of think that or live in that delusion for a while? Right? And then all of a sudden I still remember like my first aunt and uncle that got a divorce, and that wasn't the last aunt and uncle that did get a divorce, right? And then as you get older and you see more and people tell you more things, you start to realize, oh my gosh, my family has so many skeletons in its closet. There's not room in that closet to fit anything else. Can I get an amen from anybody else here, right? Like, this is part of what happens in life, right? As we get older and we learn these things. Here's why I tell you guys that. And that's true for our family as well. We certainly aren't perfect. But I think that's normal. And so the idea that, like, again, who knows, one of the theories, right? If God, like, kicked these fallen angels out of heaven and they show up and we do what we always do, where we bring sex into everything, and all of a sudden humans and fallen angels are sort of procreating and making these other beings, like, you know what? Like, the fact that that could be a part of the story seems kind of normal to me in our broken, fallen world. So, next question. How did all the animals fit? Right? You don't have to go to even that great a zoo and you're like looking at all the animals and you're like looking at the size of them, and I got to put 2 of every one of you on this big boat. Like, how is this even possible? And there's all kinds of things, right? Like, some of them could have been in egg form. All right, people have said that. Like, or you could have one animal who was pregnant, or like if you had 2 dogs as opposed to one of each kind of dog, right? Like, then you could say, well, when dogs kind of go to different places and have different exposures, maybe they could become a little bit different or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of thoughts there beyond just a boat that's big enough to literally have 2 of every kind of every animal in every form on the boat. More about this question with the next question. Here, though, as we wonder about stuff like this, the broader and much more important points that I think the Bible's trying to make here are that, one, God always provides a way of salvation, right? Like, why did God send the ark? Why did God have Noah do this? Because God always provides a way of salvation. Way more important than how did he fit all the animals on the boat is that God wants to provide a way of salvation for everyone, right? And the other part is that God always carries forth a remnant of his people no matter how bad things get, right? There's always a way that God sort of figures it out and keeps things going. I remember buying a commentary about the parables of Jesus, and the subtitle was Parables, Stories with Meaning, right? When Jesus would tell a parable, he would tell a story, and the intent of that story was to communicate something, right? To convey a point, to tell us what the meaning was. And I would just say this because a lot of times we get really bent out of shape about, is this just a story? Did it actually happen? Like, and we get so into the weeds and into the details. Listen, sometimes we so dissect a story that we miss or forget its meaning. Do you see that? Like, sometimes we're like, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? And we dissect a story, a biblical story, to such an extent that we actually miss what God had for us in giving us the story. And we got to be careful not to do that. Because when we miss the point, we miss it all. So here's the next question, which kind of ties in with that. Was the flood local or global? Was like the flood over the whole earth, or was it just sort of in this area? Now, Genesis 7 tells us this. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, and the waters increased. They lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. This would be a really bad time to discover that your boat design didn't work, right? So good thing that it was actually floating. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on the land perished, birds, livestock, and animals. All the creatures that swarm over the earth and all mankind, everything on dry land that had breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out, people and animals and creatures that move along the ground, and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him on the ark. The flood waters were on the earth for 150 days. So some of you would be like, Rob, this is a really easy question, right? Was the flood local or was it global? Well, the Bible says that the waters flooded the earth. Question answered. End of story. But let me ask you this, and again, I don't care what you believe about this, because again, it doesn't matter. But let me ask you this. If you lived and everything you knew about the earth, all that you knew existed, was underwater, and you were recording that, would you not record it and write about it like it was everywhere? And if you were, here's like the earth, and you were here, and you didn't even know that a here existed, right? Like, whether here is underwater too or not is completely irrelevant to you, right? So you would write about it. If everything you knew of your world was flooded, you would write about it like it was a flood for everywhere. Now, again, I told you this, I'm going to tell you it again. I don't really know whether it was a local flood or a global flood. All I know is that that too makes no difference to my faith. But if it was a local flood, it would sure solve the animals problem, right? Because there might be animals in other places that were still kicking. Again, I don't care what you believe about that. Last question. Could a primitive culture really build a tower to heaven? That's a really good question, right? Like, think about this. And actually, what it says in the text is to the heavens, right? Genesis 11 tells us this. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So are we to believe that this primitive people figured out how to make bricks, and then they figured out how to bake bricks, right? So they kept their form and didn't just crumble. And then all of a sudden, boom, since we all speak the same language and we're working together, we can reach the heavens. Does this make sense? Like, we are unstoppable. We have figured out a way to get to God. Is this realistic? I don't know. Is this part of an origin story about where languages came from? Maybe. I don't know. But there's a bigger point here, and here's what it is in all of this. Take notice that we are always trying to supplant God with ourselves. Have you seen this? Adam and Eve in the garden, they were given one rule. They broke their one rule. Like, can you imagine this? Everything is perfect. You're going to live sin-free, pain-free. You're going to enjoy everything in life. There's going to be no such thing as work or toil, right? Oh my gosh, this is amazing. We only have this one rule. And they're like running to go break the one rule. Like, why would you ever do this? Because the temptation was that they could be like God, knowing good from evil. And then the people's evil and arrogance required God to sort of, as he looked around at how awful and broken and bad and fallen we had become, required an ark and a flood. And this same evil and arrogance also kept people from God's offer of salvation on that same ark. Listen, here's a way out you could get on. And instead, they chose to scoff and mock this and then drowned in their arrogance. And this was so bad that God actually promised he would never, ever do this again. And we're given the beautiful sign of a rainbow. And then Babel in Genesis 11 shows us that in our own strength and with our own technology and teamwork, we can get to God on our own, right? We don't even need him. We can just figure it out and we can get to God on our own. It's crazy, right? We're always trying to supplant him with ourselves. Now, I get it. Like, for these questions and maybe others, you might be thinking, well, Rob, like, I've heard, I've learned, I've gone to a seminar, I've read a book, and I don't agree with what you're saying. I don't agree with your answers. I think we can know answers to those questions. I think it's kind of clear. So I think that, I want to talk about that with you. Listen, you might be angry right now if that is your perspective about some of these things. But listen, all of the groups that purport to have definitive answers about this are all kind of my way or the highway groups, right? They're like, nope, here's what we teach. And guess what? We can't let anybody else give any other information about any kind of different thoughts or approaches to this because we've got to control it. And listen, truth doesn't work like that. You know this, right? If something is true, we should be able to have an honest conversation about it, right? If you poke it a little bit and it falls over, it likely wasn't true. If it requires our perfect logic and words and approach and defense in order for it to stand up, it might not be true. And in all this, in our sin, all of us tend to want to make everything about us, don't we? I know I have this tendency, and it's sinful. It's always sinful when we make it about us. And I see this all the time in the church. One of the ways I see it, and I like to talk about it this way, because this is one area I struggle with a lot of things. This is one I don't struggle with. But I hear from people all the time, and they're like, oh, Rob, I'm just never asked to do anything. And I laugh at that because for two reasons. One is anybody in here if I performed your wedding, I'm trying to see. I don't know. Maybe not. There was in the last gathering. So I tell everybody who comes to me and says, will you perform our wedding? I'm like, listen, if I never do another wedding ceremony between now and when I die, I will not be any less happy, right? Because I don't care about a wedding ceremony. They are easy. It doesn't take long to do a wedding ceremony, right? I could do one like that without notes, my eyes closed, whatever. What I care deeply about is marriages that last. I care deeply about that. That's super important to me. And so there have been times where people come to me and said, oh, Rob, we're so sorry. We asked so-and-so to officiate our wedding because we've known them for decades. And I'm like, awesome. Like, woohoo. Can I come and celebrate and eat some food? Awesome. It's totally great, right? And the other reason I laugh when I hear that is because I literally can't think of a time where people were consistent in saying, hey, can I be involved? That we didn't say, absolutely, because there's tons of stuff we need and we want everybody to be involved. And so we love that. The other thing, and we were talking last month, and this has happened in the last month or so. And I want you guys to know this because I want you to know I don't just say things, but I try to practice what I preach. That's a good thing, right? And so in the last month or so, I had somebody who approached me with a little bit of an accusation, like, hey, there's this situation, and it's basically all your fault. And so those words came to me, and in my mind, I had some blame, but it was more like 10%, right? And so, like, I in my mind, I knew I was right. And we all do this, right? Do you do this when you know you're right? You start formulating like your argument? Anybody do this? Right? Okay, so do you guys want to know what I did? It was like, I thought about it, right? Like, can't believe that person said that about me or to me or whatever. Here's what I did. I responded, I'm sorry. And I owned the whole thing. I thought I was about 10% responsible. But I apologized and I owned it because the relationship with the person that I knew and cared about was worth way more than me being right. Do you guys know this? There's stuff that's more important than us being right. And you know what? As soon as I apologized, everything de-escalated and the relationship was great. Isn't that what we want? Oh, church, we just miss it so much of the time, right? I was right in my mind, but there was something so much more important. So, as we're in this series, the beginning, the end, and everything in between, we've talked about this preoccupation that in the church we have with the beginning. And I think sometimes, we think of preoccupations and we think, well, that's a secular one and that's a sinful one. When our preoccupations are about the Bible, a lot of times we feel a lot more holy about that. And listen, like that doesn't make it any better. Next week, we're going to talk about our preoccupation with the end, because that's another one. And as weird as people who have a preoccupation with the beginning can be sometimes, people have a preoccupation with the end, a little more touchy. So we'll talk about that next week. And then the final 2 weeks, we're going to focus on the dash. But I want to give you some of that each of these first 2 weeks as well, because I think it's the whole point, right? It's the important part. And so our series verse, which I love this verse, it'd be a great one to hide in your minds and your hearts to memorize. James 1:27 says this: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. With every common question that comes from Genesis 1 through 11, I told you honestly that while I have thoughts and ideas and I've read books and I've been to seminars and taken classes, the ultimate answer is that I really don't know for sure. But how about this passage? Here, Jesus' brother is telling us if we want to live a religion that crushes it, right, there are two things we have to do. Focus on the things that help those in need and things that make you holy. That's it, right? Like your life should focus on the things that help those in need and things that make you holy. So help, care for, look after widows and orphans in their need. How clear is this? Is this pretty clear? Right? And this is not an optional thing. It's not that's a great idea. When I retire and I have a lot more free time, I really want to volunteer and help with this. No, it's not like that. This is, well, Rob, that's not really my passion because I really don't like kids, which makes orphans worse. And old people smell, so I don't want to, No, this is not whether that you're passionate about this. God is telling us this is the kind of religion, this is the way His people are to live. And when He sees that, it brings Him great joy that we have done this. And it's not just to look after people like widows and orphans in their time of need or when they're in distress, but it's also this other thing. It's not we pick or choose. It's and to keep yourself from being polluted by the world. How amazing would it be if we did more of that? It seems like most people live their lives like, woohoo, let's see how dirty I can get. And then maybe Jesus can clean me up on Sunday, right? No, let's keep ourselves from being polluted by the world. So it's so simple. We are to help and we are to be holy. When people see us coming, they should be like, oh, I'm so glad the Christians are here, because they're always so helpful. And when they're present, they're willing to pitch in and contribute and make a difference. And man, those people, they're set apart. I can tell they are living their lives for God and not for themselves. It's perfectly clear and unambiguous. My Old Testament theology professor always talked about how he wished God had given us more information from Genesis 1 through Genesis 11. And then he always followed that up with this great principle. He said this: if God didn't give us enough information to know something, that is most likely a sign it was not important to him that we knew it. Isn't that great? Like, if you are literally reading the Bible and you're like, I don't really know, and you read some commentaries and you talk to other people and you're like, the answer's still unclear. And why didn't God give me clarity on this? Likely it's because God's like, it doesn't matter, right? And yet, we, as we often do, totally miss the point. And so we form organizations and we read books that boldly answer questions that are not apparently important to God, all the while missing all the stuff He was and is crystal clear to us about. Isn't it true that sometimes truth comes to us and is reinforced by really simple things? So, Charlie Brown, the great philosopher, and the greater philosopher, his dog Snoopy, are sitting on the end of a dock one day, looking out over the water and just sort of pondering the meaning of life as you do while you're sitting on the end of the dock with your dog. And Charlie Brown, in sort of this moment of brilliance, says to Snoopy, "We only live once, Snoopy." To which Snoopy replies, "Wrong. We only die once. We live every single day." Isn't that so good? Church, why not fill every day with the best and fullest life we can? Why don't we allow our lives to echo the words of the Apostle Paul, "For me to live is Christ, and for me to die is gain"? Because you see, some people spend a lot of time on this ball, but don't really live much. They live the same day, the same week, the same month, the same year, over and over and over again, a bunch of times till they die, and that's it. Why don't we live life while we're here? Why don't we make a difference with our lives while we're here? And listen, I already said this. Preoccupations are fine. We all have preoccupations. But sometimes we let those things go too far. And sometimes when our preoccupation goes too far, I don't care if it's about the first 11 chapters of the Bible or something totally different, then our lives are an exercise in missing the point. I don't want to miss the point. I don't think you guys want to miss the point. But it requires some intentionality. And listen, as long as you're hearing these words, it's not too late. Right? If you're not here anymore, it's too late, right? But if you're here in this room, you're tuning in online, you're listening later in the week after you've recovered from your fair, fog, whatever, it's not too late for us to refocus and take things that are preoccupations that have caused us to miss the point and the purpose, and to refocus in a way where we're living life on purpose, with God in mind.